Hi guys, welcome back. When we left off, Jane had jumped into the stream to try to save Mr. Swan's canoe during the storm because the chimney collapsed and the whole house collapsed, and she ended up getting really badly endangered and had to let go of the canoe and grab onto this ledge and claw her way out, and she makes her way back to camp and everyone's glad she's back. So let's see what happens. We're on chapter 11, or the particulars of domestic economy. Remember, economy is money, like jobs and money and how you get money. That night, we were back in Mr. Russell's flea-ridden cabin. Mr. Russell just shook his head when he saw me and spat a wad of tobacco. "So you're back?" he asked. "It appears that I am," I said. "You'll be fixing supper then, eh?" "I suppose I shall," I said with resignation. Mr. Swan had lost almost everything in the storm except his precious diary. But he was most melancholy over the loss of his canoe, and in the days following the storm he took to drinking liquor to console himself, and spent his nights guzzling whiskey with whatever men were in Mr. Russell's cabin. I was reminded of the drunken men roaring on our doorstep on Walnut Street. Mr. Swan would soon have a cracked head like one of Papa's patients if he kept it up. After a week of this nonsense, I woke him up early one morning and dragged him down to the beach. I hoped the bracing morning air would sober him up. "Jane," Mr. Swan moaned, his eyes bloodshot and bleary. "I won't be able to get my oysters in." "Oysters?" "Yes, the harvest is in a few weeks' time." "I don't understand." He stood and pointed to a shallow part of the bay. "There," he said, but all I saw was the bay glinting in the sunlight, the water rippling like a canvas sail. "Those are rich oyster beds, precious as gold. Men think nothing of paying a silver dollar for a shucked oyster," Mr. Swan said. I knew that oysters were all the fashion in the States. Papa said there was nothing better this side of heaven than an oyster dipped in whiskey. I personally found them revolting. They looked like dead slugs. "Mine's over yonder," he said, pointing to an unremarkable patch of still water. "Toke helped me find it, but I can't harvest a single one without my canoe." "Can't you buy one of Chief Toke's canoes?" "It'll take ages to send word to my banker in San Francisco, and quite honestly, my dear, I'm fair broke." I didn't know what shocked me more, the fact that Mr. Swan was broke or the fact that he'd revealed his plight to me. Miss Hepplewhite always said that matters of finance should never be discussed between gentlemen and ladies. Furthermore, if Mr. Swan was in bad financial straits, how was his family in Boston surviving? Who was supporting them? "I'm ruined, Jane," he said mournfully. "Ruined." It had taken some time, but Handsome Jim discovered my trunk buried in the rubble of Mr. Swan's house. He dug it out from the mud and debris and dragged it back to Mr. Russell's cabin. I greatly feared the contents, like Mr. Swan's prospects, were ruined. Sudie sat cross-legged at my feet. Remember, Sudie is Suisse's little girl. The little girl was terribly pleased that I had not been washed out to sea with Mr. Swan's canoe. Apparently, my adventure was the most exciting thing that had happened since the British arrived on the bay. "Open the trunk, Boston Jane," she said excitedly. Her English was, as Mr. Swan had said, excellent. "Let's hope for the best," I told the little girl, opening the chest. Sudie peered in and clapped her hands. "All is good," she declared. She was correct. It appeared that all was in good order. I rummaged through what was left of my trousseau. There was one warm quilt, a stray pillowcase, several tablecloths, a number of embroidered pocket handkerchiefs, underclothes, the Bible that had belonged to my mother with the family dates written on the front flap, and my etiquette book, The Young Lady's Confidant, which I couldn't help but think was utterly useless out here. I barely resembled a proper young lady myself. My entire wardrobe had been reduced to the Chinook skirt and calico blouse, and they were both in very sad state. I desperately needed to obtain some fabric, not to mention decent shoes. Handsome Jim had not been able to locate my shoes in the wreckage of the lodge. I could wear my wedding shoes in the meantime, but they were very delicate and would be quickly ruined in this muddy country. I fingered the fine handkerchief with the embroidered violet and recalled the rush of pride I had felt at winning first place in embroidery at Miss Hepplewhite's. Sudie grabbed the handkerchief and wrapped it around her clam doll like a dress. "Can I have this?" She smiled up at me with hopeful eyes. "You may have it," I corrected her. She squealed in delight and ran out of the tent, chattering to her doll. I returned to my trunk and found my greatest surviving treasure, the one thing of value that hadn't been bartered away, my wedding dress. Next to it was the small packet of green silk ribbons William had given me so many years ago. I took one and idly started to braid it into my hair. Sooty appeared in the door, dragging a very reluctant-looking Suisse. She seemed strangely subdued. She had no doubt heard of my experience in the river with the canoe and wished I had drowned. "Boston Jane good?" she asked in a tentative voice. "I'm well, thank you," I said cautiously. Could it be that she felt bad that I had almost died? Her eyes lingered on my ribbons. "It's a ribbon. Would you like me to braid one into your hair?" I asked. Suisse stared at it for a moment and then nodded, her eyes softening. I went behind her and brushed out her long, thick hair. She sat very still. It didn't take me long. When I'd finished, the ribbon looked like the first green spring shoot, peeking out from dark, rich earth. "Green suits you," I said, meaning it. She touched her hair self-consciously, a little smile on her lips. Mr. Russell had a scrabbly mirror on the wall. I brought it over to the table and held it in front of her. "Look," I said, standing behind her to admire my handiwork. "You look beautiful." Her eyes met mine and she nodded. She looked curiously over at my trunk. "That's my trousseau," I said. "What's left of it." "What means trousseau?" "Things the woman brings to a marriage." Suisse nodded her head in understanding. "I bring 3 canoes to marriage. Slaves, too." "You have 3 canoes?" I was suddenly excited. "Good canoes. Father and brother, they make them," she said, examining herself in the mirror. "Can you let Mr. Swan have one?" I asked. If Suisse had a canoe, perhaps Mr. Swan could trade for one. Then his worries would be over. Suisse narrowed her eyes. "He have trade for canoe, Swan?" No, I said, my face falling. "Maybe you have trade," Suisse said slowly, looking significantly at my trunk. I shrugged. Sooty clapped her hands excitedly, and Suisse began to hunt through what was left of my things. She tossed aside the books, but pulled out the pocket handkerchiefs and pillowcase, tracing her finger over the embroidery. She set them aside and pulled out a white linen tablecloth. She had a good eye. It was the best one. "For the table," I explained, "to cover it." Suisse rummaged further. Now she ruffled through delicate lacy underclothes, pulling out a beribboned pair of drawers. Drawers would be underwear, what we would call underwear. Turning them this way and that, inspecting them, she held them up to me. Can you imagine someone pulls your underwear out and is looking at it and holding it up? "What for this? Hold baby?" I flushed at the very thought. Really, trying to communicate with Indians was very embarrassing on occasion. "You wear them," I said, illustrating. "They're underdrawers for wearing under your clothes? Like corset?" "Exactly," I said quickly, anxious to be finished with this discussion. Suisse nodded briskly. Her mouth dropped open at what she pulled out next. "This like skin of elk high in mountain," she whispered, stroking it reverently. "This like snow. It's velvet." "Velvet," she said, trying the word out on her tongue. "It's my wedding dress," I said, wondering if I would ever get a chance to wear it. So velvet is a material, it's very soft and kind of fuzzy. It's really smooth. So Suisse is like, wow, she's never felt velvet before. "Wedding?" "To get married in, to William," I said. An expression of excitement flitted across Suisse's face. She clutched my dress to her chest. "I trade canoe for velvet." "You want my wedding dress?" I was aghast. "But you can't. It's for my wedding." Suisse shook her head as if this did not concern her. "Do you know how much work it took Mary and me to make that?" "Much work to make canoe? Who Mary?" she challenged. "My friend. She's dead." "Father dead," she countered. "Brother too." I looked at the beautiful confection, white and creamy as a rose, fit for a real bride. If my prayers were answered, Yellow should be on his way back with William, but I had to survive in the meantime. I had no funds left, and I badly needed things, especially some new shoes and sturdy fabric for dresses. Miss Hepplewhite's lesson on the particulars of domestic economy, Chapter 15, had been limited to advice on managing household money doled out by fathers or husbands. She had been rather remiss on the subject of actually earning it. "Trade for a canoe," Suisse demanded. Do you guys think that she should trade her wedding dress for a canoe? But how could I give up my wedding dress? The dress that had taken Mary and Mrs. Parker and me nearly 2 months to sew. We had labored over every seam and stitch, endlessly discussed where to add each scallop of lace. It seemed that all my girlhood hopes and dreams were sewn up in that dress. To trade all that for a canoe? I looked at the growing pile of empty whiskey bottles in the corner and felt a sick sense of inevitability. Something had to be done about Mr. Swan before he pickled himself. If Mr. Swan had a canoe, he could harvest his oysters and lend me some money to tide over until William arrived. I grudgingly admitted to myself that I could make a new wedding dress, although it would never be half as beautiful as this one. Very well, I said in a resigned voice. You may take it. You may have it. Cerise looked down at the dress, smiling triumphantly. Then suddenly she looked up at me, a strange expression on her face, and fingered the ribbon in her hair. She petted the dress tenderly as if it were a kitten. After a long moment, she put the wedding dress down and picked up the tablecloth. I trade canoe for table cover, Cerise said, not meeting my eyes. I looked at her, startled. The tablecloth? Tablecloth, she said, her voice strident. But, I said hesitantly, but it's not worth the canoe. It's not a good trade. Tablecloth, good trade, she insisted, nodding. She smiled and pushed the wedding dress toward me. Very best trade. Thank you, I whispered. She nodded firmly. We looked at each other for a long, silent moment. Then she snatched up the drawers with a giggle. Under drawers, too. So what do you think about what Cerise just did? Mr. Swan was overcome when he discovered what my bothering had reaped. My dear girl, he cried, hugging me tight. However did you manage it? It must have been a great sacrifice. I thought of Cerise's formidable reputation as a trader and simply smiled. That's for me to know, Mr. Swan. In any event, it was a very kind thing, and I shall repay you, I promise, he said, rubbing his eyes watering. I nodded. It was very nice to see the old man smiling again. Shall we go and see this canoe? Cerise had arranged for Handsome Jim and some of the other young men to paddle the canoe to the beach. The canoe was truly something to behold. It was well over 40 feet long and nearly 6 feet wide, considerably bigger than Mr. Swan's old canoe. Mr. Swan gave a low whistle of approval. That is a capital canoe. It certainly should hold 1 or 2 oysters, I conceded. Brandywine barked at the men in the canoe, and they teased him by tossing bits of smoked salmon in his direction. Mr. Swan grasped my hand. Well, partner, welcome to the oyster business. Partner? I looked at him in astonishment. Respectable young ladies did not work outside the home. It simply wasn't done. I couldn't go into business. Could I? But Mr. Swan shook his head firmly and gave my hand a hard shake. I've got the beds and you've got the boat, he said with a broad smile. We're in business. Now, what are you going to name your canoe? Brandywine barked loudly. I smiled. The Brandywine, of course. Now that we had a canoe, we needed someone to transport the oysters to San Francisco. We'll get McCarty to help us, Mr. Swan said. McCarty was a jovial fellow from Tennessee who had come to Shoalwater Bay around the same time as Mr. Russell. He lived farther up the bay and was one of the principal oystermen in the territory. He was responsible for purchasing the oysters of most of the pioneers and shipping them to San Francisco on the schooner he hired. I'll buy your portion of the oysters and pay you same day, McCarty said. Capital, my good man, Mr. Swan said, rubbing his hands together. We have to time the harvest with the arrival of the schooner. If our timing's off, the cargo will spoil, Mr. McCarty said. But how do we know when to harvest the oysters, I asked. Because remember, they don't have any refrigeration. So the minute they pull those oysters out of the water, it's not like they can sit around for a week. They need to get them into the schooner, which is a small boat, and get them up to San Francisco. McCarty spit a wad of tobacco. He had the same disgusting habit as most of the men who congregated in Mr. Russell's cabin. Chief Toke will know when it's best to harvest. Seeing as we've got to use his men to help, we might as well go ask him. It's that simple, I asked. Mr. Swan grinned. McCarty is married to one of Toke's daughters and is a favorite of the chief. You're married to an Indian? I asked. I must confess I was shocked. It was one thing to have acquaintances who were Indians, but to marry one? McCarty nodded. That I am. He did not seem the least bit embarrassed. Come over for supper sometime. That evening, McCarty, Mr. Swan, and I went to see Chief Toke. Cerise greeted us with a gracious smile, and we sat down at the fire in the center of the lodge. The tablecloth, I noticed, was lying across a bunk. Sooty ran over and hugged me around the legs. Chief Toke was in a very good humor. It soon became clear that he had already had a bargain in mind for their services on the oyster beds. Lump of chalk, Chief Toke said. Blankets and molasses? McCarty countered. Chief Toke shook his head. Lumpachuck. What is lumpachuck? I whispered to Mr. Swan. Mr. Swan leaned over to me. I'm afraid, my dear, that is rum and water. Grog, so it's alcohol, he whispered. The white men introduced it to the Indians, and while it is now illegal, some of them haven't lost the taste for the spirit. The Indians weren't the only ones I wanted to say, but I held my tongue. Lumpachuck, Chief Toke repeated. Suisse sighed heavily. I thought of all the men in Philadelphia that Papa had treated, and of Mr. Swan's latest trouble, and it seemed a shame that the pioneers had brought their bad habits to the Indians. Suisse's eyes met mine across the fire. I could tell she had the very same opinion. McCarty and Chief Toke argued back and forth for some time. Finally, Suisse suggested they gamble to settle the dispute. McCarty agreed. They're going to gamble? I asked. It hardly seemed a proper way to conduct business. Toke and McCarty are great gamblers, Mr. Swan said, and he chuckled. It's quite commonplace for people around here to settle disputes this way, my dear. What is the game? They're going to play La Hull, Mr. Swan said. It's a game of chance. McCarty and Chief Toke went at it with a vengeance, using discs with colored edges made from cedar. After they shuffled them around skillfully, Mr. Swan attempted to explain the complicated rules to me. In no time, the lodge was filled to capacity with spectators who cheered on the men with raucous shouts. The men's hands flew so quickly that I couldn't follow who was winning. Oops. It was hard not to be swept along in the excitement. It was a heady feeling, the notion that my future would be determined by a game of chance, but the whole oyster venture was one big gamble, was it not? As much of a gamble as a young pie-stained girl learning how to become a proper lady. It was, I realized abruptly, a gamble worth taking. Then a thought struck me like a rotten apple. What would William say? Would he want his future wife working? How could I even consider such a thing? I took a deep breath, considering the possibilities. I needed money. It was hardly proper, but if I had learned anything in this wilderness, it was that the rules must be bent on occasion. After all, I reasoned, if William had been here in the first place, I would not be in such a predicament. It grew late, and I fought to keep my eyes open. Smoke hung in the air from the pipes, and suddenly, I cannot say why, I was back in our parlor on Walnut Street, and I smelled Mrs. Parker's cherry pie. I heard Papa's low voice reading Rip Van Winkle. Oh, Papa. Time to go, Janie. Time to go to bed, Janie, Papa said, his eyes smiling. I blinked. Papa's face blurred, and before me was Mr. Swan, his hand on my shoulder, shaking me awake. Time to go home now, Jane, Mr. Swan said gently. Who won? I asked, wiping the sleep out of my eyes. Mr. Swan grinned jubilantly. Our man. The three of us walked back to Mr. Russell's cabin through the still dark night. My father-in-law felt that we ought to wait several weeks before harvesting the oysters, McCarty said. I was still amazed that McCarty had beat Chief Toke at a Chinook game. Why did Suisse suggest that the men gamble? Chief Toke could have easily won, I said. Mr. Swan cleared his throat. I fear it was Toke who was outfoxed. Suisse intended from the start to get provisions for her people, not liquor. And in order to do that, she had to let her husband keep his dignity. You might say she knew McCarty was the better player. You cheated? I asked McCarty. Not exactly. Let's just say my wife taught me some of the same tricks her father taught her, he said wryly. It worked out in the end for everyone, Mr. Swan said happily. Suisse got provisions, and we secured help. At last, help for me to supervise, although Miss Hepplewhite had given no hints on running an oyster business. The next morning, McCarty sent word to the schooner Hetty to be in Shoalwater Bay on July 15th. So that's the end of our chapter, and I will see you next time.